こんにちは、ゆうこ先生です。This is a sample lesson from my online course at Smile Nihongo Academy. In the lesson, we will discuss how to use 可能動詞 potential verbs or potential form in sentences. Japanese potential verbs are a type of verb that expresses the ability or capability to perform an action. In English, can or be able to is added to a verb for this function, but in Japanese, the form of the verb itself is changed. They introduce potential verbs in lesson 13 in the textbook GENKI Volume 2 and lesson 27 in みんなの日本語初級2. If you have these books, please refer to those lessons. では始めましょう。We have learned how to conjugate potential verbs in the previous lessons. Today in this lesson, let's use these verbs in actual sentences. Here's a quick review of the key points. This la in do verbs and the irregular verb come are often dropped in daily conversation, so I'm going to use these shorter versions in this course. For the negative form, of course you can use the masen ending just like regular verbs. However, this nai desu ending is more commonly used in spoken Japanese, so I'll use this version from now on in this course, okay? Okay, let's use these potential verbs in sentences. 卵を食べれないです。お酒を飲めますか？テニスをできます。パーティーに来れますか？ I'm going to discuss these example sentences. These are not the final versions yet, okay? Let me show you how to change them to the most typical sentences with potential verbs. As you can see, these two are questions because they have the question particle か at the end. As always, this is all you have to do to turn a sentence into a question. To ask, can you? You only need to put the particle か after the potential verb. Now, let me talk about the particles. These direct object marker を can be replaced by が when you use potential verbs. In fact, it sounds more natural to use が than を with potential verbs. And when it comes to can do, できます。Only が is acceptable. We don't use the particle を with できます。But when the original particle is other than を like this, you don't change it, okay? Please leave it as is. The particle が can only replace を but not other particles. So this is the first point that I want you to remember. With potential verbs, we usually mark direct objects with the particle が. It's not wrong to use the particle を as long as the verb is not can do, できます. But with potential verbs, the particle が sounds more natural to mark direct objects. Let's expand these sentences into more authentic ones. Here's the first example. I have an allergy, so I can't eat eggs. アレルギーがあるので or から is okay too. 卵が食べれないです。アレルギーがあるので卵が食べれないです。We say アレルギー for allergy. アレルギー、アレルギー。The next example. You can use テニスができます in a sentence like this. I can't play ping pong, but I can play tennis. 卓球はできないですけど、テニスができます。Here you have two sports in contrast, so it sounds more natural to mark テニス with the particle は because は highlights contrast. 卓球はできないですけど、テニスはできます。卓球はできないですけど、テニスはできます。If you change the topic of the sentence like this, you mark the person with the particle は to. 彼氏は卓球はできないですけど、テニスはできます。So the particle は is used for two different functions in this sentence. You can also drop des before the conjunction けど, and by doing so, the sentence sounds slightly more casual, but it is still formal speech since you have mas at the end of the sentence. 彼氏は卓球はできないけど、テニスはできます。彼氏は卓球はできないけど、テニスはできます。Now let's talk about these two questions. To ask potential questions, can you? You only need to put the particle か at the end, as I mentioned earlier. To answer yes to the question, you respond with the same potential verb. はい、飲めます。はい、飲めます in this case. To answer no, you respond with the negative potential form. いえ、飲めないです。いえ、飲めないです。This いえ here doesn't mean house, okay? It's the shorter version of いいえ. And again, this version is more commonly used in spoken Japanese, so I'll use いえ for no in this course. You can also add an adverb to your response like this. いえ、全然飲めないです。いえ、全然飲めないです。or いえ、全く飲めないです。いえ、全く飲めないです。Now, this question, can you come, is a little tricky because how we perceive going and coming is different from English speakers. English speakers respond from the listener's point of view when they use motion verbs. So if somebody asks, "Are you coming?" they respond, "Yes, I'm coming." But we, Japanese speakers, use motion verbs from the speaker's point of view. So when someone asks, "Are you coming?" we say, "Yes, I'm going." Therefore, to answer this question, "Can you come to the party?" we respond either, "Yes, I can go," or "No, I can't go." はい、行けます。はい、行けます。or いえ、行けないです。いえ、行けないです。Please keep this in mind and be careful with your response when people ask you a question with the verb come. Now, if you are invited to this party and you can't go, it's always better to say すみません before you say 行けないです。And the consonant M in this me is often dropped for easier pronunciation, and most Japanese people say すいません instead of すみません. So let's use this version, すいません in this course. So you just learned how to ask questions with potential verbs and how to respond. If your answer is yes, I can, you use the same potential verb in your response. If it's no, I can't, then you use the negative potential form for the verb. And when someone asks you, can you come? Be sure to use the potential verb can go in your response. And of course, you can create open-ended questions with question words like this too. What can you drink? 何が飲めますか? 何が飲めますか? Where can you come? どこに来れますか? どこに来れますか? I hope you now understand how to use potential verbs in sentences or questions. Okay, can you tell me what you can or cannot do in Japanese? Is there any language you can speak? Any food you can't eat? Or any instruments you can play? Please leave your Japanese sentences in the comment section below. I hope you enjoyed the lesson. This was a sample lesson from my course number 7, Potential and Volitional Form. You can access this course along with other courses by joining Smile Nihongo Learning Pass. This subscription plan gives you access to my entire library of lessons, quizzes, PDFs, and MP3s for a low monthly fee. It offers a flexible way to continue your Japanese learning journey. There are 2 options available for the learning path. You can choose either one that works best for your budget or level. The curriculum for each learning path is in the description below for you to download. To learn more about our Learning Path program, please visit smilenihongo.com/learningpath. You can find the link on the screen or in the description. ではまた次のレッスンで会いましょう。